Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, ramming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about VBC, including our upcoming schedule of in-person and online events. Sign up for our VBC magazine and our VBC blog, all on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. Today's guest on The Scuttlebutt is Dr. Mitch Maki. He is the president and chief executive officer of Go for Broke, a nonprofit based in California. Their mission is to educate and inspire character and equality through the virtue and valor of World War II American veterans of Japanese ancestry. If you know anything about World War II history, after Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, there was obviously a lot of fear and hatred of the Japanese here on the home front. And in February of 1942, Executive Order 9066 was passed through Congress. This created camps here at home in the United States that they moved Japanese Americans into. This is an absolute black mark on the history of America, and we get into that. Dr. Maki and I talk about that, talk about what was like in the camps. Obviously, even the word camps, when you think of World War II, you think of Germany and the concentration camps. So we dive into how those camps differed from the ones here in America. And what I found really interesting is that Japanese Americans that were living in these camps, some of them actually did serve in the U.S. military. They served in the European theater. They also served in the Pacific. And we talk about the men. We talk about their families. We talk about the book that Dr. Maki co-authored, Achieving the Impossible Dream, which detail how Japanese Americans obtained redress and the U.S. government acknowledged the wrongs that they committed during this time. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope that you stick around for the full one, and also check out Go for Broke's website here in the description, as well as Dr. Maki's book, Achieving the Possible Dream. You can find that link down there in the description as well. And also, please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever we release new episodes. And you can always reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any thoughts, comments, questions, or concerns. Thank you again for supporting the podcast, and enjoy the show. Joining me now is Dr. Mitch Maki. Mitch, you are the president and CEO of Go for Broke, the National Education Center. I can't wait to get more into the nonprofit and all of the wonderful work that you are doing. But I was so excited also to just be reached out to ask to become under the Scuttlebutt. Love for you to introduce yourself. Welcome to the Scuttlebutt.
Well, Sean, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And as you mentioned, yes, I'm the president of Go for Broke National Education Center. And I'm not a veteran myself. My father was a veteran. He served in the Army in the Korean War. But we at Go for Broke National Education Center really focus on World War II, the experience of the Japanese American soldiers who were born and raised in America, were American by tradition and loyalty, who chose to serve our nation during World War II, even though a good number of them had families that were incarcerated in camps at that time, or for the young men from Hawaii, uh, their families were treated as second-class citizens and they were distrusted at the time. And another little-known fact is that there were a number of women who served during that time, not in combat at that time, but served in the WACs and
Mhm.
helped to uh, push the war effort forward. And all of these young men and women demonstrated the wisdom of America's promise. And that's the promise that in our nation, no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the faith that they choose to keep. And I think these young men and women did a fantastic job in doing that.
There's a lot to get into. I'd love to dive a little bit into your personal history of like your father served Army, Korean War. What was that like? Did he talk about it? And how you eventually decided that this was a passion of yours that you wanted to come out and be a part of Go for Broke.
hmm So my parents are what we call Nisei, second generation, and the way Japanese Americans count that, it's the immigrant or generation is the first generation. The firstborn American generation are the second generation, the Nisei, and that's my parents. So they were both born and raised in Hawaii. They were both young adult or teenagers, really, around the time of Pearl Harbor. And my father was just a little too young to serve in World War II, but then went on to serve in the Korean War. Eventually, they moved to California, and I was born and raised here. So I grew up knowing my father was a veteran, and he was a decorated veteran. He earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, so he was wounded. So I would actually grow up seeing the bullet wound in his shoulder, and he would tell me the story about how he got the bullet wound and so forth. But like so many other veterans, the stories that he would tell me about wartime were the ones that were very, you know, benign, and there were sometimes the funny stories that he could remember, or the stories that he thought I as a child could digest. And he really never got into the gruesome details. And my father saw combat. He literally was on the front line. So I grew up knowing that he had served. And somewhere along the lines, when I was a young boy, I learned of the Japanese American history, of how during World War II we were distrusted and we were treated like the enemy because we shared a common heritage, and that in fact we were sent off to camps across the United States and incarcerated for 3 to 4 years of our lives. And you know, my family was in Hawaii at that time, so they were not sent to camp because the Japanese Americans weren't sent to camp from Hawaii. But I remember thinking, oh, this couldn't be Japanese Americans like me and my parents. It had to be maybe the Japanese from Japan that they captured somehow or something like that. And then I learned no, these were American citizens of Japanese ancestry.
Mhm.
Two-thirds of those who were incarcerated were born in America, were raised in America, and were loyal by tradition and practice. And the other third, like my grandparents, generation, had been here some for 40, 50 years. My grandparents immigrated in 1900.
Oh,
So
wow.
by the time World War II started, they had been here 40 years.
Yeah.
And the reason why they did not naturalize, and all the other Issei first generation did not naturalize, is because they were prohibited by law at that time from naturalization. Japanese in America were considered aliens ineligible to citizenship. That was the legal term, and they were prohibited from naturalizing, and that didn't change until the 1950s.
Why did they decide to come over?
My grandparents,
Hmm.
primarily for economic reasons. There was a chance to have a better life in America. Many of the Japanese, they were men at first who came, and they were oftentimes the second, third, fourth born son in the family. So they weren't going to inherit the family's wealth, because in Japan at that time, the oldest son inherited everything. And in different parts of the country of Japan, there were economic hardships, that there wasn't a lot of ways to make money. And at that time, Hawaii was just opening up and they needed laborers. They needed people who could fish and who could farm. And that's what a lot of the Japanese immigrants at that time came from, farming and fishing families. So, just from an economic point of view, it made a lot of sense. Their ambition at that time was go, make a lot of money, and come back to Japan as a rich man.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, very quickly they found out that wasn't going to be the reality, as it was backbreaking labor. It was uh, difficult and hard work, and it paid pennies,
Yeah.
type of thing. And then it wasn't until later that the women started coming over, and by that point, the Japanese immigrants realized this is our country now. This is
Hmm.
where we will um, uh, plant stakes and raise a family. And as soon as they started having children, that was even more cemented, as people my parents' generation became the first true Japanese Americans, bicultural, where they would speak Japanese to their parents, but at school they'd speak English. At
Hmm.
home they might eat Japanese food. At school they would eat American food. And I know my father and his generation grew up knowing that they were American. There was no
Yeah.
question in my father's mind. He had never been to Japan. He spoke a few words of Japanese and so forth,
Mhm.
but truly had adopted the American culture and American values.
And so was there a sense of community where were there already immigrants here that they could have friends, they spoke a different language. Was it difficult to like integrate into the society?
Well, and there are basically two different stories here. There's the
Mhm.
Hawaii story, because
Yeah.
Hawaii being an island, being much smaller, uh, the immigration, and there was a workforce immigration, not only of Japanese, but of Chinese, of Filipinos, and so forth. So it
Hmm.
was a very multi-ethnic kind of experience there. And there was a large number of Japanese immigrants who started to create that community that you're referring to.
Yeah.
On the continental United States, the same thing was happening. There was still immigration here. There was work to be done and jobs to be filled and so forth. But because of the vastness of the continental United States, it's just spread out a lot more. And there became Japanese enclaves that served as community, and people would migrate there. Partly because people wanted to be around others that were like them, that shared a similar background, but also because of the redlining laws of the time where,
Mhm.
you couldn't live in certain places if you were of Asian descent or in particular of Japanese descent. So, Japanese immigrants were kind of forced to live together in community.
Oh. And we know Hawaii was not a state at this point,
Correct.
but a lot of the Japanese Americans who were living, would you call them Japanese Americans living in Hawaii at that time?
At that time, you would, because
Yeah.
in fact, even though they were a territory, every territory is treated a little bit differently.
Mhm.
The territory of Hawaii, if you were born there, you became an American citizen. So
Mm.
my parents were born in Hawaii as a territory and were considered American citizens at that time. So truly, they were Japanese Americans. Of course, they didn't have the representation at that time in Congress and so forth, so they didn't get to vote in the same way.
Do you think that in their experience they come over and you're coming from your home country in Japan, and you obviously have a lot of pride in what your home is. So this is the new home, and do you think a lot of the American fear towards immigrants, and you could count even nowadays as that, but the fear at that time to immigrants was sort of like, you're foreign, do you hold American values over Japanese values, and how did they navigate that? Because I'm sure it was a very difficult thing to work through with your new neighbors.
You know, what you're describing really is the acculturation and assimilation process that all immigrants go through when they come
Yeah.
to America, right? You leave your homeland and what you know, and then you have to adopt a new homeland with new values and new cultures and make that transition. And then you layer over that your homeland goes to war with your new country. I
Yeah.
mean that's an incredible context for any ethnic group, any immigrant group to figure out how do you navigate that. And for the hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans that were here or Japanese in America, there are different stories as to how different people dealt with it, right? But the overwhelming majority of both Japanese immigrants who came here and their first generation offspring who were born here realized that this was their country, you
Hmm.
know. And yes, there may have been some um, mixed loyalties at first, and nobody. The best way I heard it once put is when your mother and father argue, you don't want either to win. You just want the argument to stop. You
Yeah.
know.
Right.
And I think for many Japanese Americans, that was the initial feeling. It's like, oh my gosh, mom and dad are arguing. This is not going to be good, right? But in particular, for the American-born Japanese, there was no question in their
Hmm.
mind as to who they were. They were born and raised here. They had never been to Japan and so forth and so on. So, clearly in their minds, they were American. Now, having said that, there were some individuals who eventually said, "Send me back to Japan."
Mm.
Especially after the incarceration started to occur,
Yeah.
as they said, "Well, if you're going to do this to me, I'm not staying. Send me back." But they were the vast minority.
Yeah.
And let me also say, for context, that throughout World War II, there was not one Japanese American who was convicted of any type of sabotage or espionage or betrayal of America.
Hmm.
And in fact, as you know, the record speaks the opposite way, where these young men would go off and fight in Europe and in the Pacific theater, and become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for length of service. I mean, it's an incredible story when you think of it in that context.
Well, absolutely, and there's some minute details in within that I want to get to. I think first I want to when was it the Executive Order 9066?
Right. So
Was it
let's
anywhere
back.
in their, like, did they think that America would do this at all? Create these camps that they would then be forced to live in?
I think again, for all the hundreds of thousands of folks that Japanese Americans that were in America, everyone would have their own opinion, and
Yeah.
it would be spread out across the board. But I think when we think back at that time, everything happened so quickly,
Mm,
and later on there would be a commission hearing that talked about how the camps were wrong, but that the camps were the result of wartime hysteria,
hmm
race prejudice, and
hmm
a failure of political leadership. And that wartime hysteria and the race prejudice just mixed together in such a volatile way at that time. So if we go back and start with December 7th,
hmm
1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. And immediately, Japanese Americans began to wonder what would happen to us.
hmm
Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, two-thirds of whom had been born here,
hmm
or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common heritage, right?
hmm
And immediately the FBI started picking up Japanese Americans. I mean, literally that day and the day after, FBI was knocking at people's doors, taking the heads of families away. So, the rumors started spreading very quickly. So
hmm
at that moment, anything was possible. Yeah, in,
Yeah.
in terms of what's going to happen to us, right? In answer to your question. Um, and then 2 months later, February 19th, 1942, so a little bit over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, is when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which created the underpinnings by which the Japanese Americans on the west coast of the United States would be removed from the west coast and then sent off to camps. You know,
hmm
so again, things were moving so quickly. The FBI moved very quickly in starting to arrest leaders in the community, both in Hawaii as well as on the mainland. So there was that sense of hysteria and this sense of racism that was
hmm
going on at the time. The other point is that during World War II, the Nazis were considered by Americans as evil men. The Japanese were considered an evil subhuman species. You know, it it
Interesting. Yeah.
it 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 wasn't simply, oh, we're fighting them, they're the enemy, but there was that mixture of racial animus that gets rolled into that,
hmm
that uh, these aren't even human beings that we're dealing with.
Right.
And the truth is, most Japanese Americans at that time were either in Hawaii or on the west coast of the United States. So, if you lived anywhere from Nevada east, you probably didn't know a Japanese American. You probably hadn't
Right.
seen one, or I mean, it's just a very small number of people east of Nevada really understood who these folks were that called themselves Japanese Americans.
Can we define the camps as, what were they like? What was the living conditions? Because I think it's difficult. Like for myself as a civilian, you obviously everybody knows the concentration camps in Germany and how inhuman and awful they were. And you hear like there were Japanese American camps, or even I've heard them called concentration camps as
Mhm,
well.
mhm.
How did they differ from the German ones, and were there similarities?
Okay, excellent, excellent question. And in fact, yes, there are a large number of people, including myself, who refer to these camps in America as America's concentration camps.
hmm
Let me be very clear. That's in no way to compare what happened to Japanese Americans to what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany. The incarceration of 120,000 people is not the same as the uh, elimination of 6 million human beings,
hmm
which happened in Nazi Germany. And in fact, there are some who say, the camps that were in Nazi Germany weren't really concentration camps. They were death camps. And in
Right.
fact, the Jews called them death camps and extermination camps. So, yeah, I don't want to get caught up in semantics
Right.
in that sense. The camps that were here in America meet the definition of concentration camp in a sense that they concentrated people. They brought them together. And there were 10 main, what were called War Relocation Authority camps. Those are the ones that we normally think of: Manzanar, Hart Mountain, Tule Lake, Roar, Jerome, the main ones. And then there were some minor ones. But the main 10 were located everywhere from Eastern California all the way out to Arkansas. There were two camps in Arkansas. And by and large, they were located in the most desolate places one can imagine. In California, Manzanar's in the middle of the desert.
Mhm.
Beautiful when you're in your car, but during the summer it gets well over 100. In the winter, well below freezing, type of thing.
Mhm.
Uh, Other places just desolate swamplands that they could find and so forth. So they were located not in the best of areas, and literally they were surrounded by barbed wire, and there were machine gun towers and there were military gates with armed sentries. And the machine guns weren't pointed outward to protect the Japanese Americans. They were pointed inward to control the Japanese Americans. It was very much communal living. You would live in barracks. Several families would share long barracks, and initially they were just separated by hanging blankets or hanging sheets, and eventually they would be able to build up some walls. But privacy was really not something that these families got to enjoy. Mess halls were where you ate. Latrines is where you did your private business. Communal showers and so forth. Um, there was no extermination of human beings in like in Nazi Germany. There were people who died in these camps, some of natural causes or causes related to being incarcerated in the middle of the desert.
Mhm.
There were a couple of instances where there were resistance riots or where a sentry, ordered somebody to stop and shot them and so forth. And again, these things happened, but they were not the norm of everyday living. The other interesting thing that your listeners may find interesting, because so many times when I start talking about this, people will say, I want to interview somebody who was in camps. I want to know what it was like firsthand. Well, if you interview somebody today who was 5 years old in the camp, they're like 85 years old,
Yeah.
85, 90 years old. So they're going to have a child's perspective of what the camp was like. And for some of them, it was actually fun, in the sense that they were with other kids, their parents protected them and so forth. It's unfortunate that the generation above them who lost everything, they're no longer with us. And we have a lot of interviews with them on videotape and so forth. But it's that generation and even the generation above them who lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their businesses, they lost their communities. But most of all, for the adults, what was lost was a sense of place at the American table of citizenship. Were we Americans or were we not?
So the war is going on, and these families are all, they're concentrated here. How did What happened that made the American government come to them and say, we need more men? And
Right.
why? I think that's the biggest question in my head is why, once you've been put into this situation, would you say, yeah, I'll fight for you?
That's an excellent question. Yeah. And so, immediately after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, there were Japanese Americans who were in the military at that time, and especially in Hawaii. The Hawaii National Guard, or Territorial Guard as it was referred to at that time, was made up of a lot of Japanese Americans who immediately took up positions on the beach in around Pearl Harbor to protect the island. And you have to put yourself in that mindset that for many of us on the mainland, we had never even heard of Pearl Harbor. It's some
Yeah.
distant place in a place called Hawaii and so forth. But for the Japanese Americans, and actually for all the Americans living on Oahu, this was personal.
Mhm.
The Japanese didn't just bomb America, they bombed our backyard. And when I speak to the veterans of that time, they'll remember the sounds of the bombs exploding, the seeing the Japanese aircraft flying overhead, and literally feeling the vibrations of the explosions. And then many of them will talk about, knowing people that were killed that day,
Mhm.
both civilian as well as military. So for them it was very personal, and it was more than, a nation has attacked our nation. A nation has attacked us. And so for many of them, they were ready to go to battle and saying, let's do this, right? Uh, so shortly after December 7th, within the next few days, they had their guns taken away from them, the Japanese American soldiers, and they were deemed 4C, enemy alien unfit for duty. Yeah.
Wow.
And they were sidelined. So they couldn't be discharged from service because of ethnicity, but they could be sidelined. Eventually, the Hawaii Territorial Guard was transformed into the 100th Battalion, and they were then mobilized and sent off to Mississippi for training. And then they were eventually put into battle in Europe, in first of all, Northern Africa, and then they would go into Italy. And their initial record of just um, loyalty and valor on the battlefield impressed the army officials, and to the point where the army decided, okay, let's expand this experiment, because the army needed more men to
Mhm.
go and fight in Europe. And so let's expand this experiment and let's create a segregated unit of Japanese Americans called the 442nd, and the 100th would become a part of the 442nd. And so then the call was put out in 1943 for young men to volunteer for the 442nd.
Mhm.
On the first day that they could, 10,000, 10,000 young men from Hawaii said, send me. They said, I want to sign up. They're raring to go for all the
Mhm.
reasons we just talked about. On the mainland, in these camps, it was quite a different story, as you alluded to, right? It's like, why would I go and fight for a country that has taken everything away from my family? But on that first day, over 1,200 young men from the camps said, yes, I will go, you know, and thousands would follow them after that. But, you know, Sean, as you alluded to, it was a very difficult decision.
I can
On
imagine.
one hand,
I'm sorry to
go ahead.
interrupt. I
Yeah.
think about it because a lot of times we ask our veterans, what did your parents think when you said I'm going to go enlist in the Marine Corps, and what'd your mom say? And you know, I I'm sure that it was difficult for those parents, being a parent myself, especially in the situation that I've been forced into, to look at my kid and say, yeah, like if you do this, you could die, but you could also stay here and be incarcerated, rock in a hard place. What do you choose? And in a video that I watched of a previous interview from you, I think it was a Masuda. He
Yes,
said
yes,
this is the only thing, the only way I know how to give my family a chance in America.
exactly. So yes, yes. So on one hand, you know, there were family ties and families were scared, right? They're
Yeah,
they're in the middle of the desert, they're surrounded by barbed wire. We don't know how the war's going to go. We don't know what the future holds, and so some families felt like we've got to stay together. They've taken everything from us. Don't let them take the family. We got to stay together, right?
mhm.
And for many of the older Japanese Americans, or they didn't speak Japanese. I mean, they didn't speak English. The,
Yeah,
the the immigrants, right? So they needed their oldest son to stay and help translate and be a part of the family. So there was and then there was also the outrage of, how dare you? They say they want to take my son after they've taken everything else, and how can you fight for a nation that does this? And even though many of them loved America, it was a feeling of, give me back my rights, and then I
yeah.
will go and fight, right?
Hmm.
On the flip side, there was a feeling like, hey, they don't trust us now. They don't think we're Americans. And if we say no, I'm not going to go and fight, I'm just proving them right. And the future for me, the future for our family, the future for our future generations, it's all gone if we don't prove that we are American, right?
Mhm.
And that's where the quote that you just talked about, Kazuo Masuda, who was a young Japanese American who was in the 442nd, he was asked once he was in battle, why are you doing this? Your family's back home in Arizona behind barbed wire. And he said, because this is the only way I know my family can have a chance in America. You know, right or
Mhm.
wrong, agree with it or not, the Japanese American soldiers of World War II understood that in 1943, 1944, and 1945, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood.
And that was a quote I had heard you mention before, and that really stuck out to me. That the loyalty was demonstrated in blood, and that's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. You know, and that's, in Japanese, there's a phrase, "Okage-sama de,"
Mhm.
because of you, I am. And that's a feeling that resonates throughout the Japanese American community for what these soldiers did. They paid in blood for the ability for someone like me to go on and live my life. I mean, Japanese Americans today have so many opportunities, as do all Americans, right? But that was paid for in blood. And as we oftentimes say, this isn't just a great Japanese American story. This is a great American story.
Mhm.
This is the story of the sons and daughters of immigrants who, in one generation, came here and said, this is our nation. We are American, and we stand for what America stands for. And that's so true for so many other groups, too. And, no one should question the Americanism of an individual based on their race or their background.
And it wasn't like when they decided to raise their hand and say, I'll go fight, that things got easier outside of the camp because it was a segregated army. And despite being with other Japanese Americans within their unit or their battalion or their combat team, they still were who was their superior officer, and
Oh,
were
yeah.
those white Americans, and did that was that difficult to follow?
Yes. Their commanding officers were white Americans, and the range of their attitudes about Japanese Americans range from knowing nothing about Japanese Americans, having very racist views of Japanese Americans, to some knowing about Japanese Americans because they trained with them or had been with them in Hawaii and other places. So, but I don't want to cast it all as all the white officers were bad because they weren't. There were some that very much earned the respect of the Japanese American soldiers. But you know, initially, especially initially, Japanese Americans were the unit was treated as cannon fodder. They were oftentimes the first into battle, and having to cross open fields under heavy artillery and machine gun fire from the Nazis. So, as we talked about earlier, they became the most highly decorated unit of their size for length of service in American military history. The reason for that, unfortunately, is because they were awarded so many Purple Hearts.
Hmm.
And as you know, that's the medal that you receive when you're wounded or killed, and so that um, you know that you're right. When they volunteered, you know, things didn't immediately get better. And there was no deal on the table like if you volunteer, your parents get out or anything like that. It's just you come volunteer and you can hope for whatever you want to hope for. And then a year later, after this is 1943, they're asking for volunteers. Well, the experiment, if you will, goes so well that the army decides, okay, we're done asking for volunteers. We're now drafting
Mm.
individuals.
Yeah.
So now, Sean, you get your draft notice, and it's no longer, oh, do I want to go or do I not want to go? It's either I go or I resist and I go to the penitentiary.
Yeah.
And there were some Japanese Americans at that time who resisted and said, in Wyoming, there was a Heart Mountain camp, and there was a group of 63 young Japanese Americans, and they were known as the Fair Play Committee. And their stance was, give me back my rights and I will fight.
Hmm.
And if you don't, I won't fight. And they were very principled and they were well ahead of their time, because
Yeah.
hell no, I won't go. That was like 20 years later, right? With
Right.
the 60s. And unfortunately for them, many of them were branded as cowards,
Hmm.
as traitors to the Japanese American community. Because this is a heated debate. I mean, let's be very clear about this. People had strong feelings one way or another. You got to serve or you don't serve, and families literally stopped talking to one another. Within families, people stopped talking to one another if they chose one over the other. And these young men at Heart Mountain, as well as elsewhere, were branded as cowards, when in fact they truly weren't, because many of them would go on and serve in the U.S. military in the Korean War,
Hmm.
several years later. So it wasn't that they were unwilling to serve, but they were very principled about why they should serve or under what conditions they would serve.
As they were sent off to war, somebody listening in says, I've never heard of the 100th Battalion or the 442nd. Could they easily just Google that and find out some of the battles or their journey, like where they went, where they were at, the battles they were a part of?
Yes, definitely. You Google 442 RCT, things will pop up. 100th Battalion, things will pop up. Go for Broke, things will pop up. Go for Broke National Education Center, things will pop up. Once you start there, you won't have any problems. And a lot of your listeners may also have the question, well, why do you call yourselves Go for Broke? What
I
is
thought
that?
I have that written down.
Okay, so let's go there because some people know the term now, and it essentially means go all in. You hear it in sports a lot or in gambling, like let's go for broke, let's go all in, let's give it our all.
Mhm.
And it originated in Hawaii. It was a gambling term. And the guys from Hawaii love to gamble. I mean, my parents, as I told you, are from Hawaii, man. Gambling is a part of our family, type of thing. And the term was go for broke, let's go all in. And the attitude was, let's take this same feeling and apply it on the battlefield.
Mhm.
Because the stakes are high. We're going to go for broke. We're fighting not only for our country, we're not only fighting against the enemy, we're fighting for our futures in America.
Incredible. What were their jobs? You mentioned like being cannon fodder, being the tip of the spear, but translators, what type of jobs were they given?
Well, in Europe, they were a full-on unit. I mean, they had everything from uh, the scouts to the infantrymen to the medics to the cooks to the supply chain operators. It was the whole 9 yards, right?
Okay.
Um, uh, and in fact, the 442nd had its own artillery unit, which is the 522nd. And we'll
Mhm.
talk about that in a minute because there's an incredible story about the 522nd. You mentioned translators, and that's the other half of the story, which is that in we're talking about Europe, but also in the Pacific theater, the Army or the Marines in particular were interested in and needed translators and interpreters and intelligence specialists. So for those Japanese Americans who were in America who had some linguistic ability with Japanese, they grew up maybe speaking more Japanese at home. Some of them did go to Japan for a couple of years when they were children and so forth.
Mhm.
So they were handpicked out and sent to Minnesota for the Military Intelligence Service and were trained in sharpening their language skills. They were then shipped off to the Pacific Theater and they would interrogate POWs. They would translate intercepted messages. They would uh, um, serve as intelligence specialists. And their experience was a little bit different because, unlike being in a segregated unit in Europe, like their brothers might have been, right? They might have been the only Japanese Americans stationed with a Marine unit.
Yeah.
And so they're out there by themselves, and their Marine unit doesn't know who they are initially, doesn't know to trust them, and so forth. And some of these guys did some incredibly heroic things. Like what they would do is they would crawl at night, a mile or two across the jungle, get to a Japanese encampment, eavesdrop on what the officers were saying, and then sneak back out to the American unit and say, okay, the Japanese are moving in the morning. They're going to attack here. They're going to do X, Y, and Z. And even General MacArthur gave them credit for giving so much information to the American Marine units, right? There's another story in the battle at Saipan where the Japanese were being pushed northward and they would be hiding out in caves and they would hold civilians hostage. The Marines had cornered about 8 Japanese soldiers in this one cave that had about 100 civilians that they were holding hostage. And the MIS soldier, Japanese American, Bob Kubo, said, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to talk them out. And his own commanding officer said, I don't think that's a good idea. And he goes, no, too many of our Marines have died. This has got to stop. So they literally lowered him down. He went into the cave. He came out later and he said immediately the 8 Japanese soldiers surrounded him, their guns drawn, and they didn't know what to make of him. They thought he was a traitor and
Hmm.
so forth to the Emperor of Japan. But he talked them into understanding that he was an American and that he served his country, which is the United States of America. He also told them, "Look, you're surrounded. There's no way you're getting out of here. There's no reason these people need to die. There's no reason you need to die." So they eventually let him go, and they said, "We'll let you know what we're going to do at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Either everybody's coming out or nobody's coming out."
Yeah.
So they let him go. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the American Marines are watching, wondering what's going to happen. And sure enough, the civilians start coming out.
Hmm.
The Japanese soldiers said, let them go. And then the Japanese soldiers came out and surrendered. But, the idea of crawling into a cave with armed enemy soldiers in there and your only real weapon is your mouth that's incredible. Yeah.
Unbelievably brave. Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
almost, yeah, that's I'll stick to that. Unbelievably brave,
Right, right.
terrifying.
One other story that I need to tell. There was another MIS specialist, and his name was Kazuo Yamane. He was actually stationed in Washington, D.C. His Japanese was so good, they had him doing high-level stuff, right? And they found this box that had fallen off of a Japanese freighter, and they brought it to Washington, D.C. There's all these notebooks and stuff in there, documents in there, and it was labeled of no military value. But they said, take a look at this, see what's in there. Literally, the first notebook that he takes out, he starts reading it, and he realizes that it is a description of where all the armaments are stored in Japan, manufactured and stored. And so
Wow.
as he's deciphering all this and translating all this, and then he turns it in, and he didn't even understand the importance of it until years later, right? But
Mhm.
the army took that and said, oh my goodness, they now knew where to bomb when they attacked Tokyo and other parts of Japan, where they should drop the bombs to destroy the stronghold of arms for the Japanese military. And that helped to end the war years earlier than might otherwise have happened, saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict. And then after the war, these Japanese American soldiers served as interpreters and translators in the war crime trials that were held in Japan. And they also helped to reintegrate all the soldiers coming back into Japan and helped to write the Japanese Constitution, which stands to this day. And, as we know, Japan now is one of our strongest allies in the Pacific theater. And in large part, it's due to the Constitution that was written after the war, the Japanese American linguists had a big hand in.
So as we get to the end of the war and these Japanese American soldiers start coming back and reintegrating into their communities, when were the camps closed and when were they allowed to go back to, was their home even still there when they went back into, California, Hawaii, and you know that had to be a mess.
It was that's a great description. It was a mess, right? So the camps start to close between 1945 and 1947. It takes a while to dismantle the camps and send people home and so forth. And Japanese Americans who are in the camps are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to go and reestablish their lives, right?
Hmm.
And some of them went east, like to places like Cleveland and Chicago, but many of them came back to the West Coast, right? And as you can imagine, and you mentioned your father, it's like, what would be our concerns, right? Put a roof over our head, put food on the table, send the kids back to school, get a job, rebuild our communities, right? But there was also, for the Japanese Americans who were in camp, a sense of shame, a sense that somehow we had done something wrong to bring this egregious violation upon our community, right?
Hmm.
It's the classic identification with the aggressor. It's like we bought into we were not 110% American. And that's why a lot of Japanese Americans who are my age, and I'm in my early 60s, um, and Japanese Americans maybe even a little older than me, we don't speak Japanese because our parents didn't want us speaking Japanese. They wanted us speaking English. They wanted us being 110% American. So
Hmm.
this would never happen to us again, right?
Right.
So that's the civilian population. The veterans come back and they say, "Oh no, 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 no! We just put our lives on the line. We fought for this country. I saw my best friend get killed on the battlefield. I saw my brother shot up. And they had just given it. They had gone for broke, right? They had
Right.
given it their all. They were coming back and they say, we deserve full rights of being an American citizen, right?
Hmm.
So, especially in Hawaii, the veterans came back, took advantage of the GI Bill, went back to college, and they became the lead, the political leaders, the business leaders, the educational leaders in Hawaii, right? And
Hmm.
Hawaii is the only state that can say they've had two Japanese American governors. They've had a number of Japanese American U.S. senators and Congress people galore, and their state assembly almost all Japanese Americans. And I jokingly say to my friends in Hawaii that you cannot grow up in Hawaii and have gone to the public schools without having a Japanese American teacher and a Japanese American principal. I mean, it's just
Hmm.
that pervasive. So
Yeah.
they helped transform the territory of Hawaii into the state of Hawaii, which
Hmm.
it became a state in 1959.
Yeah.
On the continental US, the impact was a little bit less because it's so much bigger, and the Japanese American numbers are so much smaller. But Japanese American veterans came back, and their feeling was, this isn't right. We've got to not consider ourselves second class citizens.
Hmm.
But there are many anecdotes, many stories of just a pervasive racism that still continued after the war. Uh, Senator Dan Inoue, who became a very powerful senator throughout his career, he was a member of the 442nd. He lost his right arm in battle.
Hmm.
He went back to San Francisco at one point on his way back to Hawaii and wanted to get his hair cut. And the barber said, "I don't cut Jap hair." So and that's just an example
Yeah.
of the kind of individual racism that these people would face.
So they come back, they start to build that community. It didn't all just happen though. They didn't just come back and then were accepted as Americans. This had to go through civil rights into the 60s. They fought, like your father fought in the Korean War. But it took a long time for America to redress the wrongs that they had committed during World War II. How did we get to there? Because with this decades of fighting to get those rights, to get that that respect, that appreciation.
Right, right. And I could speak for hours on this. So, Sean, if you want me to come back at some point, I'd be more than happy to come back. But
Yeah, we're kind of flashing forward a bit. I want to gather the story in the hour we have, but I want to make
right,
sure that
right,
there's
right,
many
right.
stories we're leaving on the table.
You know, we're leaving more on the table than we're covering, but
Yeah.
thank you for the opportunity. The 50s is a time of great change for America. 1952, we have the McCarran-Walters Act. It allows Japanese to naturalize for the very first time. So,
Hmm.
that's a small change. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education that says separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. The
Hmm.
civil rights movement with Rosa Parks starts in the 50s, and then 1959, Hawaii becomes a state, and Danny Inouye is elected as the first representative
Hmm.
to go to Congress from this new state of Hawaii. So, what better symbol of loyalty to send than somebody who fought for this nation and literally gave his right arm?
Hmm.
The 60s comes around, it's even a greater time of change, right? We have the civil rights movement in full bloom. We have the anti-war movement where young people are saying, hell no, I won't go. We have the women's movement where people are, young men and women are really questioning what is equality and what does it look like?
Hmm.
And then we have the ethnic studies movement where young, uh, minority students are starting to question what was the history of their communities. And that was
Yeah.
true of Japanese Americans, where a lot of young Japanese Americans in the 60s said, what the hell happened? Why didn't my grandparents resist? We would have resisted. We would have said, hell no, we won't go,
Hmm.
but they don't realize it was a different time and a different place, right?
And were there Japanese Americans who served in Vietnam as well?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. And they went through that whole experience, of being Asian American in a war where you're fighting again other Asians and the racism that's going back, and they weren't in segregated units at that particular time. And then of course just the reaction that the general American public had to returning Vietnam veterans,
Yeah.
and how we demonized, Vietnam vets for no fault of their own, for what they had to endure and what they had to go through and what they had to do to serve our nation. Uh, so just again, I'm hitting the treetops on this one, but in the 70s, the Japanese American community starts to argue amongst itself. Do we want to fight for an apology or do we want to just let it go? Like the elderly in particular said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to remember. I don't want to have to feel that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
Just let it go. Another group would say, no, what was done to us is wrong. And we're deserving of a good, clean apology. Just give us an apology, no money,
Yeah.
because if you give me money, you're insulting me.
Yeah.
You're putting a price tag on my civil liberties. And then the
There's an
third group,
acknowledgement. There's an acknowledgement that needs to take place of
yes.
you. Yeah.
And then there's a third group that said, yeah, we're deserving of an apology and we're deserving of some money because it wasn't like they just called us names and hurt our feelings. There were real material losses. My
Yeah.
father lost his farm. My uncle died in war. My mother couldn't go on to school, type of thing, right?
Mhm.
All of that comes to a head, and eventually, and again, to your listeners, I apologize. I'm giving you just the mountaintop version of the story, but eventually it turns into a bill, and the bill starts to work its way through Congress. And on September 17th, 1987, this bill is argued on the House floor. And it was argued on the House floor for a very particular reason. So I'm going to give your listeners a chance to guess. What is the significance of September 17th, 1987? Any guess?
I'm bad at history.
Okay.
You'll say it and I'll go,
So,
oh,
yeah, well, it is the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution.
oh, yeah, that. Yeah.
You've heard of that
I've heard of
that
that. Yeah.
document, right? So September 17th, 1787 is when the Constitution was signed. 200 years later, we picked that date because it just happened to be the 200th anniversary, but we
Right.
picked September 17th because we framed this bill not as being a bill about let's help the poor Japanese Americans that were put into camp. It was about constitutional rights. It was about civil liberties for all Americans. If
Mhm.
it can be taken away from me, it can be taken away from you, and we need to make sure this never happens again. And
Mhm.
on September 17th, 1987, the bill passes the House of Representatives. 243 representatives voted for this bill. 180 of them were Democrats, 63 of them were Republican. I mean, it was a bipartisan effort that
Mhm.
we probably couldn't see today in Congress, right? 7 months later, it hits the floor of the Senate and it passes the floor of the Senate. That means we need only one more signature, right? One more supporter, and that's the President of the United States. And for your listeners, who was the president in 1988? It was none other than Ronald Reagan. And for those of you who remember Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president, and there were many of us, myself included, who thought there's no way on God's green earth that Ronald Reagan is going to sign this bill. It was just too progressive in my estimation, right? But the thing about Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator.
Yeah.
He had the ability to tell stories and touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, if you could tell Ronald Reagan a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. So the question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would touch his heart and personalize this whole issue for him and align it with his political values, right? Well, you mentioned Kazuo Masuda, the young soldier who said, I'm doing this because this is the only way that my family can have a chance in America. 2 weeks after he said that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle in Italy, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family is released from Gila River Camp in Arizona, and they return to Santa Ana, California, and they want to reestablish their lives. And they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, and threats of bodily harm. The Army realizes this is a PR fiasco, that one of its own fallen heroes, his family can't move back home. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. And they bestowed the Distinguished Service Cross to his sister. Well, amongst those officers on that day was a young white American captain named Ronald Reagan.
Hmm.
Ronald Reagan was a captain in the Army at that time, and he was with that group of officers. And that night, at a banquet dinner, Ronald Reagan addressed the audience. The Masuda family was there. The parents of Kazuo Masuda were there. And Reagan says, the blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks.
Wow.
That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 80s, and his response was, I remember what those soldiers did for America. It wasn't the only reason, but it made it personal to him. It aligned it with what his vision of a greater America should be. And because of that, and some other political reasons, on August 10th, 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided an apology and symbolic monetary reparations to the Japanese Americans who were affected by Executive Order 9066 40 something years earlier.
Yeah, I was just looking 46 years later.
Yeah,
What did
yeah.
it mean for the Japanese American community?
I had the good fortune of writing a book with a couple of other authors called Achieving the Impossible Dream. Yeah,
Hmm.
and it was about this whole story that we're talking about. It was the impossible dream. The idea that this terrible, terrible, terrible thing could happen to us. And then our nation would apologize for that and in a symbolic way give us money. You know,
Hmm.
America had never apologized to anyone for doing that type of thing. So it was the impossible dream come true. And it was validation that we as a community, that our sons and daughters who served during World War II had done the right thing, you
Hmm.
know. And I remember speaking to an elderly man. Well, he was elderly to me at the time, and on the day that the bill passed, and he said he must have been in his 80s at that time, and he said, "Today, for the first time since World War II, I feel like an American."
Hmm.
I mean, the pain the shame, the stain of what happened during World War II, even though the community had risen up and done well, and Japanese Americans went on to, live successful lives. There was something still deep inside of them, some existential feeling that it wasn't complete until that apology occurred. And so that's how I view it as a Japanese American. As an American, I view it as the strength of our nation. No one person, no one nation is perfect. And when our nation makes a mistake, it had the strength and the courage to own up to that mistake. It says a lot about who we are as Americans.
Mm.
And, you know, for those listening too, the number of people on both sides of the aisle, from Ted Kennedy to Newt Gingrich, from Norman Mineta to Dick Cheney, right?
Mhm.
We have people on both sides of the aisle come together on this and say, yeah, we got to do something about this. And yes, we need to apologize. Again, it's a case study of how strong our nation can be.
The monument behind you, where can people view that, and what was it built for?
It is in downtown Los Angeles in what's known as the Little Tokyo district. And in fact, we are building a brand new building around it.
Mhm.
And groundbreaking is in February. So, I mean,
Hmm.
this is very timely that you should ask that. We are breaking ground on a new building that will surround it and have low income housing, affordable low income housing, businesses and restaurants, and as well as an expansion of our organization footprint.
Hmm.
And it again, it's located on Temple and between Temple and First Street in downtown Los Angeles. You can Google it and find the map. And essentially, it's a sloping monument, as you can see, and on the back side is the names of 16,000 young Japanese American men and women who's literally went overseas during World War II.
Hmm.
We'll be building an additional wall for an additional 16,000 names of Japanese American veterans who served during World War II, but who didn't ship out overseas. That just has not happened yet. Um, and what's interesting is the slope of the monument is to replicate the slopes of the mountains in northern France,
Mm.
where the 442nd fought one of its most famous battles, the rescue of the Lost Battalion, where they went into the forests of the Vosges Mountains and rescued a battalion of Texas soldiers that had been surrounded by the Nazis, and they eventually saved 211 soldiers from Texas, and in the process took over 300 casualties.
Mm.
But that was the math of the day.
Um, Mitch, I want to thank you so much for joining me here and giving us sort of the overview. I'd love to have you back either on a Scuttlebutt or on one of our BBC Monday night Zoom programs. We're on usually Monday nights at 7 here on the Eastern time zone, but to hear more of this story, hear more, fill in a bit of those blanks throughout those couple decades after the war. But I'm sure even to hear more stories of some of the individuals who served in the European theater, the Pacific theater, I'm sure there's so much. And can people go to your website for Go for Broke, find any of these stories? What's the best way to interact, and how can people support your mission?
Goforbroke.org.
Hmm.
Come to our website, peruse it, let us know what you're thinking. And one of the things, Sean, too, that might be of interest is I'd love to bring a veteran on
Yeah.
to your podcast. These guys are 100 years old.
Mhm.
Literally, one of them who I know very well that I see often turned 101 last Monday. So these they're with us for just a short time more, and we need to cherish that time that we have with them. But again, I would be happy to come back on. I'd be happy to talk about whatever is of interest to you and your listeners.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And to our listeners, please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever the Scuttlebutt releases new episodes. You can always reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any thoughts, comments, or questions. I encourage you to go to goforbroke.org and look up their mission, their history. And again, I want to thank you, Mitch, for joining me and for really just the educational hour that I've got to spend with you. There's so much that I learned that I had no idea of, but I'm so happy having known it now. I'm going to take it with me moving forward.
Well, Sean, thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. Tobacco-Free Adagio Health has been supporting the podcast for quite some time now. We've been so pleased to be supported by them. They are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They're all about health, so they want people to quit. They have classes, nicotine replacement therapy, and a popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. They also educate people, children especially, about tobacco use from cigarettes, cigars, pipes, chews, snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. And finally, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health advocates for public and private policies that ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can learn all about what Tobacco-Free Adagio Health offers at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. Or you can check out the 2 Scuttlebutt episodes that featured Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. We had a wonderful representative come on to the podcast, talk to us about all the classes and therapies that they offer. It was 2 wonderful conversations, so I definitely direct you to both of those if you want more information, or just call their free quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. Thank you again, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health, for your support. We're grateful for the support of UPMC for Life, a UPMC healthcare Medicare program. At UPMC Health Plan, their goal is to improve the health of their members. They can also help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life offers a wide range of affordable Medicare Advantage plans, and you military veterans can save money and get more benefits with your Medicare plans. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans by veterans. The type of coverage you have from your service may help you decide which plan will be a good fit. If you have TRICARE for Life, UPMC for Life PPO Salute may be a good fit for you. You can view plan options, including their prescription drug coverage, compare costs, and learn about all the benefits you get when you choose UPMC for Life by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Thank you so much, UPMC for Life, for sponsoring the Scuttlebutt.